Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show that's really built for you. The person who wants the shortcut to being well-informed, but, without sacrificing the surprising details. We take the source material, the dense randomized controlled trials, the authoritative meta-analyses, and we just extract the absolute core nuggets of knowledge and insight.
Our mission today is centered on a food that sits at a highly potent and, frankly, somewhat dangerous intersection of nutrition and pharmacology.
That's a strong way to put it.
Well, it is. It's the Brazil nut.
Yeah.
It's been relentlessly marketed as a superfood, but that simplistic label completely ignores its unique chemical profile. We are going beyond the hype and focusing exclusively on the specific, rigorous human clinical evidence surrounding its potency, especially concerning that critical line between a therapeutic dose and a toxic one.
I think everyone assumes Brazil nuts are just another healthy snack, maybe a bit higher in fat. But what we found in the research literature, it just transforms this common nut into something entirely different. Yeah. It's less of a snack and more of a highly specific natural drug delivery system. If you treat it like an almond, you run a real risk.
Precisely. The core of the Brazil nut's identity is one single trace mineral, selenium. Brazil nuts, scientifically known as Bertholletia excelsa, are far and away the richest natural dietary source of this nutrient. They often contain levels that just dwarf other foods.
So it's not even in the same league?
Not even close. The distinction is critical. One single nut can easily provide 2 to 3 times the recommended daily allowance for selenium, placing it in a category all its own. So our objective here is to extract the facts from the most robust sources, the double-blind RCTs, to define the optimal, safest, and most effective dose for you.
So before we, get into the weeds of the clinical trials, what is the single non-negotiable takeaway from this whole body of research? What's the bottom line we are going to spend this deep dive justifying?
Okay, the primary conclusion that stands with high certainty is this. Brazil nuts reliably and effectively correct low selenium status and significantly boost the body's core antioxidant defenses. If you need selenium, this is the most potent natural source available.
But there's a big but.
A very big but. Because of their extreme unstandardized potency, consumers must exercise strict caution. The evidence-based sweet spot for most adults is consuming just 1 to 2 nuts most days, or maybe 2 nuts every second day.
That's it, 1 or 2.
That's it. Going beyond that invites real toxicity risks, not just from something called selenosis, but also from the natural heavy metals the plant accumulates, which we absolutely must detail later. This is a powerful tool that requires discipline.
Okay, let's start with the high certainty benefits. The research is absolutely clear that Brazil nuts reliably fix low selenium status. But what stood out to me in the source material was the mechanism. It's not just that selenium is, present in the nut. It's that it's delivered in a form that the human body finds exceptionally bioavailable and functional.
That's the critical first layer of the benefit. The majority of the selenium delivered by Brazil nuts is in the organic form, known as selenomethionine.
Selenomethionine.
Right. This is the form naturally synthesized by plants when they absorb inorganic selenium from the soil. Selenomethionine is highly efficient because it closely mimics the structure of the essential amino acid methionine.
So because it looks like a familiar building block, the body just absorbs it readily.
Exactly. Absorption rates for selenomethionine are consistently measured in human trials at very, very high percentages. We're talking often ranging from 89% up to 98%.
Wow.
Which is comparable to, or in some cases slightly superior to, many common synthetic supplements. The body doesn't waste time processing it. It incorporates it immediately, often storing it within proteins and muscle tissue as a kind of systemic reserve.
And that reserve gives you a buffered long-term supply.
Precisely.
And we have hard, gold standard clinical evidence that puts the Brazil nut on equal footing with a pharmaceutical supplement. I'm referring to that 2008 randomized controlled trial by Thompson and colleagues conducted in New Zealand adults. This trial essentially benchmarked the whole food against a pill.
That seminal study is the foundation of our high certainty claim.
Yes.
They took healthy New Zealand adults who generally had lower baseline selenium status than, say, Americans, and divided them into 3 groups. A control group getting a placebo.
Right.
A supplement group receiving 100 micrograms of pure selenomethionine supplement daily, and then the Brazil nut group.
The Brazil nut group consumed 2 nuts daily. And it's fascinating because the nuts in that specific batch actually delivered a slightly lower measured dose of selenium than the supplement group, averaging about 53 micrograms per day.
That's a crucial detail, a really crucial detail. Despite delivering half the dose of the supplement group, the results were just striking. Over the 12-week trial duration, the Brazil nut group showed an impressive 64.2% rise in their plasma selenium levels.
64%.
And this increase was statistically indistinguishable from the 61.0% rise observed in the supplement group. This alone confirms the nut's high efficiency.
Wait, hold on. If the nuts delivered half the dose but achieved the same systemic plasma level as the pill, doesn't that imply that the way the body handles the selenium delivered in the whole food matrix is somehow superior or more effective than just swallowing the isolated compound?
That is the compelling implication, yes.
Yeah.
The bioavailability is undeniable, but the benefit goes deeper than just circulating selenium levels. The nuts actually performed better when measuring the functional outcome.
The functional outcome being?
They looked at the activity of whole blood glutathione peroxidase, or GPX.
And what was the outcome there?
The Brazil nut group increased their GPX activity by a substantial 13.2%.
Yep.
Critically, this was a significantly greater change than the 5.3% increase seen in the pure selenomathionine supplement group.
Wow, so let me get this straight. The nuts not only raised the circulating selenium just as effectively as the pill, with half the dose, but they were more than twice as effective at translating that circulating selenium into the actual functional enzyme activity, the actual antioxidant work being done inside the red blood cells.
That's it.
That finding is perhaps the single strongest piece of evidence validating the whole food approach.
It confirms that the food matrix itself, the combination of selenium with fiber, the specific fatty acids, and potentially other synergistic compounds, may facilitate the incorporation of selenomethionine into the body's working machinery more efficiently than the isolated supplement alone. This is the bedrock of the benefit. Highly bioavailable selenium that effectively optimizes selenoprotein production.
Which brings us directly to the mechanism of action. Why do we obsess over GPX activity increasing? Why does selenium status matter at the cellular level?
Because selenium isn't merely a passive nutrient. It is an essential cofactor incorporated into at least 25 known human proteins. Collectively, they're called selenoproteins.
Selenoprotein.
And these proteins are the body's frontline, highly specialized defense force against radical oxygen damage. They are integral to everything from muscle function to DNA repair.
And glutathione peroxidase is the star player of that defense force.
Absolutely. GPX is an enzyme whose primary job is to neutralize reactive oxygen species, such as hydrogen peroxide and lipid hydroperoxides. These reactive species are constantly generated as byproducts of normal metabolism, but when they're unchecked, they initiate a process called oxidative stress.
Which we hear about all the time.
We do, and for good reason. It causes massive damage to cell membranes, DNA, and cellular components. So when Brazil nut consumption raises plasma selenium, it provides the necessary raw material for the body to synthesize more of these GPX molecules, ramping up cellular protection.
So measuring the increase in GPX activity isn't just a lab quirk. It's a real-time functional metric showing the enhancement of the body's capacity to handle metabolic stress.
Correct. And the consistency of this finding across multiple randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses that Brazil nut consumption leads to a moderate and reliable increase in GPX activity makes this the highest certainty benefit we have. It's what selenium does.
And this mechanism translates into tangible physical protection, measurable through specific biomarkers of cellular damage.
It does. For instance, enhanced GPX activity translates into tangible reductions in markers of oxidative stress, such as reducing malonylaldehyde or MDA.
MDA, what is that exactly?
MDA is a harmful breakdown product of fat oxidation. It's essentially an indicator that fats in your cell membranes have been damaged by free radicals. So studies show that Brazil nuts reduce circulating MDA, suggesting better membrane protection.
The sources also mention protection against DNA damage, which is a powerful claim. How do scientists even measure that in a trial setting?
They use a technique called the COMET assay. It's a microscopic technique used to determine DNA damage in individual cells. In simple terms, cells are embedded in an agarose gel and subjected to electrophoresis. If the DNA is damaged or fragmented, those fragments trail out of the cell nucleus like a comet tail.
Ah, hence the name. That makes sense.
Precisely. The length and intensity of the comet tail are directly proportional to the amount of DNA damage. The 2012 Hearst trial, which utilized 2 Brazil nuts daily over 12 weeks, showed a significant reduction in DNA damage as measured by this COMET assay. This is a critical finding because it moves the benefit beyond just enzyme activity and shows true cellular protection at the most fundamental level.
So what for the listener is clear. Brazil nuts are not speculative. They reliably correct selenium deficiency, they consistently improve redox balance by boosting critical antioxidant enzymes like GPX, and they actively protect DNA from damage, particularly in individuals starting with suboptimal selenium levels. This foundational benefit is, well, it's undeniable.
It's the most robust finding we have. This makes them an invaluable targeted interventions for anyone in a low selenium region or specific vulnerable populations, vegans, vegetarians, or those with chronic conditions that naturally increase their oxidative burden. They are the definition of an effective micronutrient delivery system.
Now we have to turn to the other side of this nutritional dichotomy, because the power we just described, that incredibly high potency, is precisely why this nut becomes potentially dangerous if consumed without caution. We need to talk about the unpredictable potency problem.
This is the single most important safety concept for the listener to grasp. Unlike a vitamin pill produced in a pharmaceutical plant, the selenium content in Brazil nuts is not standardized. It is a biological product, and its nutrient profile is dictated entirely by the soil composition where the specific Bertholletia excelsa tree grew.
That sounds like a small variation, but the source material shows that the geographic variation is absolutely staggering.
It is truly extreme. We see measured selenium content ranging from a paltry 2 micrograms per gram of nut all the way up to over 60 micrograms per gram.
Whoa.
And when we translate that variability down to the consumer level, to the individual nut, the numbers are shocking. One nut might deliver a safe, modest dose of 20 micrograms. But a nut sourced from highly selenium-rich Amazonian or Brazilian soil could easily deliver 450 micrograms.
In one nut.
In a single nut. And the research literature documents even more extreme outliers, with some individual nuts reported to contain up to 12,261 micrograms of selenium.
To put that into perspective, that is a 60-fold difference in potency between two seemingly identical products you might find in the same bag. If you're a consumer trying to follow the advice of 1 or 2 nuts a day for health, that means the entire concept of the whole food as a standardized supplement is utterly useless.
It fundamentally undermines safe self-dosing. The lack of standardized labeling poses a huge risk. A consumer buying a standard bag of nuts has no mechanism to distinguish a low selenium batch from a dangerously high selenium batch.
So you're flying blind.
Completely. If they're eating 3 or 4 nuts a day, thinking they're just having a healthy snack and they hit a high-potency batch, they can easily exceed the toxicity threshold. This makes the Brazil nut less of a generalized superfood and more of a highly specialized, self-dispensing pharmaceutical agent of unknown strength.
This inherent lack of standardization makes the discussion of the tolerable upper intake level, the UL, absolutely critical. If we treat these nuts as unstandardized supplements, we have to respect the maximum safe dose.
We must. Authoritative global bodies, including the U.S. Institute of Medicine, the IOM, and the National Institutes of Health, NIH, they generally place the tolerable upper intake level, or UL, for adults at 400 micrograms per day.
400.
For reference, the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA, often uses a slightly more conservative 300 micrograms. And this UL is defined as a maximum chronic daily intake level that is deemed unlikely to cause adverse health effects for almost all individuals in the general population.
And as we established, one high-potency Brazil nut can push you past that 400 microgram threshold in a single bite. What happens if people chronically exceed this safe limit, say 500 or 800 micrograms a day, which is easily achievable with a handful of high selenium nuts? What is the clinical picture of selenosis?
Selenosis is the medical term for chronic selenium toxicity. The symptoms are often visible and unmistakable, typically starting with changes to keratin-rich tissues.
Keratin, like in hair and nails.
Exactly. The 2 hallmark symptoms are hair loss, which can range from thinning to significant alopecia, and nail brittleness or loss. The nails often become deformed, brittle, or they just shed entirely.
That is a very specific and frankly disturbing consequence.
It is, and beyond the cosmetic changes, patients often experience significant gastrointestinal upset, fatigue, and peripheral neuropathy. And then there is the memorable chemical signature, a very distinct, unpleasant garlic breath odor.
That garlic breath odor, why does selenium toxicity cause that specific scent? What's going on there?
It's caused by the body attempting to detoxify and excrete the excessive selenium. High selenium intake leads to the production and exhalation of volatile organic selenium compounds, primarily something called dimethylselenide.
So it's not actually garlic?
No, it's not the same kind of strong odor you get from eating garlic, but patients often describe it as a pungent, metallic, or sort of burnt rubber garlic smell that is persistent and noticeable to others. It's a literal biological alarm bell.
Beyond the acute toxicity signs, the long-term metabolic risks of chronic high intake also warrant discussion.
Yes, there is a strong epidemiological and clinical association suggesting that chronic excess selenium intake, especially in populations that are already replete and then supplement heavily, is linked to an increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
So it's not benign.
No, it highlights that the disturbance is not just cosmetic, it is fundamentally metabolic. More is absolutely not better. It can generate new disease risks.
This brings us to a crucial finding from the 2019 Duarte randomized controlled trial. This study provides a vital safety signal, demonstrating that excessive selenium intake can actually reverse its beneficial antioxidant effect and become actively pro-inflammatory. This is where the therapeutic window just slams shut.
This study is indispensable for understanding the risks. They looked at obese women and had them consume just 1 Brazil nut per day, but that nut delivered a massive, documented supraphysiological dose, around 12,261 micrograms of selenium.
Which is 3 times the upper limit.
3 times the UL. The researchers were testing for benefits, but what they found was harm.
What specifically happened at that extreme level?
They monitored inflammatory markers and antioxidant enzyme expression. Instead of seeing enhanced cellular protection, the women showed a significant increase in the expression of pro-inflammatory genes. Specifically, there was an upregulation of interleukin-6, or IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha.
And those are major drivers of inflammation.
They are key signaling molecules that drive systemic inflammation. So the body was reacting to this massive selenium dose by turning up the dial on inflammation.
Wow.
And simultaneously, they observed a significant decrease in the expression of GPX1, the very antioxidant enzyme we spent the first part of this deep dive praising.
So it had the opposite effect.
The exact opposite. This suggests that when you flood the system with chronic, massive excesses of selenium, you overwhelm the necessary regulatory mechanisms, generating a harmful pro-oxidant state that leads to immune dysregulation and inflammation, directly contradicting the expected benefits.
The message is painfully clear. The sweet spot is incredibly narrow, and jumping from optimal to toxic is dangerously easy with an unstandardized food like this.
It is the textbook example of how essential micronutrients become poison in excess.
And the risk doesn't stop with selenium. We have to discuss the heavy metals that Brazil nuts naturally accumulate, specifically barium and radium. This is where the story gets environmentally complex.
This is a unique caution flag related to the plant itself, Bertholletia excelsa. It has evolved to efficiently extract and accumulate certain elements from the soil, including both barium, that's banin, and radium, Ra, which includes the radioactive isotopes radium-226 and radium-228.
So it's just really good at pulling these things out of the ground.
Extremely good. Brazil nuts often contain levels of these elements 100 to 1,000 times higher than most other common foods.
Let's start with barium. What's the concern there?
Barium is accumulated at extremely high concentrations in the Brazil nut, sometimes averaging around 1.27 milligrams per gram of nut tissue. Now, while this concentration is high, the overall safety concern is somewhat mitigated because barium compounds are generally poorly absorbed in the human gut.
So most of it just passes through.
For the most part, yes. However, some regulatory models suggest that daily chronic intake of more than 2 nuts could potentially exceed the established tolerable daily intake for barium, especially in smaller individuals or children, which raises a precautionary flag for long-term habitual consumption.
And then there is radium. This is the part that sounds like science fiction natural radioactivity in your breakfast snack.
It is a scientific reality, given the natural geochemistry of the Amazon basin soils where these trees thrive. The roots of the Brazil nut tree are extremely effective at drawing up radium isotopes. The accumulation of radium-226 and radium-228 means that even a modest daily intake leads to a measurable internal dose of radiation exposure.
How do researchers even quantify that internal radiation dose?
They calculate the annual effective dose, which is measured in microsieverts or SESEF. Studies estimate that a daily intake of just 1 to 2 nuts results in an annual effective dose from internalized radium in the range of 37 to 150 microsieverts per year.
Okay, for the average listener, that number, 150 microsieverts, is meaningless without context. How big of a deal is that? Can you put it into relatable terms?
Absolutely. So to provide some context, first, the average global background radiation exposure from the environment, cosmic rays, the ground, natural radon gas, is typically around 2,400 to 3,000 microsieverts per year. Then you have medical procedures. A standard chest X-ray typically delivers about 100 microsieverts. A cross-country airplane flight might expose you to 30 to 50 microsieverts due to the altitude.
Right.
So consuming 2 Brazil nuts every day for a year adds between 37 and 150 microsieverts to your annual total. That's roughly equivalent to getting 1 or 2 extra chest x-rays over the course of the year.
It's small compared to our total background exposure, but it's a non-trivial chronic dose of internal radiation that we can entirely avoid by just choosing a different nut.
Exactly. It warrants caution. Yeah. While 150 microsieverts is generally well below the annual occupational safety limits set by bodies like the WHO, the key issue is the long-term safety profile of this chronic ingestion level, especially over many decades.
So we just don't have the data.
We don't. The German Federal Office for Radiation Protection, for instance, specifically advises that children and pregnant women should limit their intake of Brazil nuts due to these radium concerns. The safety verdict here is less about acute toxicity and more about a lack of long-term data regarding the chronic ingestion of an internally deposited source of radiation. It's a definite caution flag for heavy habitual consumption.
Okay, so we've established the foundation. High certainty antioxidant benefits and high certainty toxicity risks. Now let's move into the murkier waters, the areas where the evidence suggests a benefit, but the certainty level is moderate to low, starting with effects on lipids, like cholesterol.
This section reveals a fascinating dichotomy in the research. The difference between an acute, high-dose pharmacological effect and a chronic, small-dose nutritional effect. The data on lipids is, well, it's inconsistent overall, which keeps the certainty low.
Tell us about the acute aha moment. What happens if someone eats a single large dose?
This comes from studies where participants consumed a substantial single serving, typically 20 to 50 grams of nuts.
So that's what, 5 to 10 nuts?
Somewhere in that range, yeah. This single consumption, which often supplies well over 600 micrograms of selenium and a powerful dose of mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids, produced an immediate short-term improvement in blood lipid profiles in both healthy volunteers and obese adults.
And how quickly did they see these lipid improvements?
Remarkably fast. We're talking about measurable, significant reductions in LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol,
Wow.
and measurable elevations in HDL cholesterol, the good cholesterol, appearing within as little as 6 to 9 hours post-ingestion.
That's practically a pharmaceutical response time. That suggests something powerful is happening to the body's lipid clearance machinery.
It does. Researchers hypothesize that this acute effect is likely due to the synergistic combination of the selenium shock influencing lipoprotein metabolism, coupled with the immediate intake of heart-healthy oleic and linoleic fatty acids, plus phytosterols contained within the nuts, which can acutely impede cholesterol absorption in the gut.
And this lasts.
Some follow-up reports even suggest these benefits, particularly the shift in the LDL to HDL ratio, can persist for up to 30 days following that one high dose.
That sounds incredibly promising for cardiovascular health, yet you insist the long-term chronic reality is low certainty. Why are long-term trials failing to replicate this dramatic acute effect?
Because when systematic reviews and meta-analyses pool data from trials lasting weeks or months, where subjects ate the recommended safe dose of 1 or 2 nuts daily, they consistently find no significant long-term change in total cholesterol, LDL, or triglycerides across the general population.
So the small chronic dose that optimizes selenium status isn't enough to structurally alter circulating lipids, and the acute dose that does alter lipids is too high to recommend long-term due to the toxicity risk we just discussed.
That's it.
That's a real translational problem for the consumer.
It is the central dilemma. It suggests the beneficial effect on lipids is highly dose-dependent, requiring a short-term massive hit, and also highly population-dependent. For example, cohorts who already had significant lipid dysregulation or high baseline oxidative stress like hypercholesterolemic or obese cohorts did tend to show slightly greater effect sizes and more consistent reductions in oxidized LDL. But for a healthy, normal cholesterolemic individual, the long-term lipid-lowering claim remains weak.
Moving on to inflammation, the evidence seems slightly stronger, but again concentrated in those special populations.
Yes, there is moderate certainty evidence supporting reductions in circulating inflammatory markers. We see this with markers like C-reactive protein or CRP, IL-8, IL-1 beta, and TNF-alpha. But crucially, these positive findings are overwhelmingly observed in cohorts with existing chronic inflammation or severe oxidative stress.
Essentially, the sicker the patient is, the more dramatic the intervention appears, because they have the most room for improvement in their selenium status and inflammation markers.
That's a good summary. The most compelling evidence comes from these clinical cohorts, and the shining example is the study involving hemodialysis patients.
Hemodialysis patients are a perfect storm for this research. They're often profoundly selenium deficient due to poor diet, altered intestinal absorption, and loss of minerals during the dialysis process itself. They also suffer from severe chronic inflammation and high oxidative stress, which contributes to poor outcomes.
Exactly. Studies on these patients, where they were given just one Brazil nut per day for several months, showed remarkable therapeutic results. The intervention didn't just correct severe selenium deficiency, it triggered a systemic anti-inflammatory cascade. They saw significant reductions in inflammatory markers like TNF and IL-6.
And this goes beyond just GPX activity, touching on a powerful fundamental molecular pathway, the NRF2 pathway.
This finding is incredibly important and often overlooked in simple summaries. The studies in hemodialysis patients showed a robust increase in antioxidant defenses, specifically the upregulation of the NRF2 and QO1 pathway.
Let's pause and explain NRF2. Why is that acronym important?
NRF2, or nuclear factor erythroid 2-related factor 2, is often called the master regulator of the antioxidant response.
Yeah.
It's a transcription factor. It's a protein that sits in the cell's cytoplasm until it's activated by oxidative stress, or in this case, potentially high-dose selenium signaling.
Okay.
Once it's activated, NRF2 translocates to the cell nucleus, and it switches on hundreds of genes responsible for detoxification and antioxidant defense, including one called NQO1.
So Brazil nuts weren't just supplying the building blocks, the selenium for GPX. They were flipping the master switch that controls the cell's entire defense system, leading to a deeper, more comprehensive level of protection.
Precisely. This suggests a systemic adaptive response where the body is reprogrammed to fight stress more effectively. And similarly, obese or dyslipidemic groups showed measurable improvements in oxidative stress markers and lipid surrogates, likely because their higher baseline oxidative stress allowed the antioxidant capacity provided by the Brazil nut selenium to manifest in greater measured improvements via this pathway activation.
Now, let's shift gears to cognitive function and thyroid support. We hear many claims about brain power and metabolism, but the certainty level really drops off here.
For cognition, we are firmly in the realm of very low certainty. We only have limited pilot evidence. The data comes primarily from a single small randomized controlled pilot trial, the Cardoso 2016 study.
Okay.
The trial involved older adults diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, or MCI, who were specifically selected because they were also selenium deficient at baseline.
And what specific cognitive outcomes did they measure after 6 months of daily Brazil nut consumption?
The sample size was small, only about 20 participants, but they reported small yet specific cognitive gains in the treatment group. These gains were seen in verbal fluency.
The ability to come up with words.
Right, the ability to generate words from a category or letter, and also constructional praxis, which is the ability to copy drawings or construct simple figures.
So specific improvements in language retrieval and visual spatial skills, but nothing suggesting a global cognitive boost for everyone.
Exactly. It seems highly probable that correcting a deficiency in a vulnerable population, MCI and selenium deficiency, allowed the brain to perform slightly better. But it's not a general nootropic effect for a healthy selenium-replete individual. It must be stressed that no high-quality, large-scale meta-analysis currently supports a robust global cognitive benefit. This is preliminary data, and replication in larger cohorts is critically needed before we can make any definitive claims about Brazil nuts as a cognitive enhancer.
Let's discuss thyroid function, which is often claimed as a major benefit. Again, the mechanism is biologically sound, but the clinical evidence is narrow.
The mechanism is irrefutable. Selenoproteins are absolutely essential for healthy thyroid metabolism. The thyroid gland has the highest concentration of selenium per gram of tissue in the body, specifically the iothyronine deionases, a family of enzymes that contain selenium, are responsible for converting the relatively inactive thyroid hormone, T4, into the highly active form, T3.
So if you're selenium deficient, your T4 to T3 conversion might be sluggish and your thyroid protection is compromised.
Correct. And the evidence shows that correcting deficiency in special populations, again like the hemodialysis patients, can significantly improve thyroid hormone parameters. We observed increases in active T3 and free T4 in those studies.
So it works if you're deficient.
Right. And furthermore, high-dose selenium supplementation has shown potential in reducing thyroid autoantibodies in certain forms of autoimmune thyroiditis. However, and this is the key point, there is no consistent evidence to show that adding Brazil nuts to the diet of a healthy, selenium-replete individual provides any additional benefit to thyroid hormone levels or function. If your selenium levels are optimal, your deiodinases are already working at peak capacity.
This section is absolutely crucial for maintaining scientific honesty and bringing us back to reality. We have spent significant time discussing biochemical markers, GPX, NRF2, oxidized LDL, but when we try to connect those markers to actual disease prevention or longevity, the data just evaporates.
We must state this unequivocally. There are no human randomized controlled trials showing that chronic Brazil nut consumption reduces what scientists call hard clinical endpoints. We are operating entirely on plausibility, not proof.
What do you mean by hard clinical endpoints?
We are talking about the outcomes that actually matter to patient health and mortality. This includes things like cardiovascular events, so reduced incidence of heart attack or stroke,
Right, the big ones.
or cancer incidence, a verifiable reduction in the diagnosis rate of various cancers, and of course, all-cause mortality, which is the ultimate measure of longevity.
The absence of data on these endpoints means we cannot make claims about Brazil nuts curing cancer or extending life, even if the antioxidant boost looks great on paper.
Exactly. This distinction between surrogate and clinical outcomes is fundamental in medical science. All the positive data we discussed, the reduced oxidized LDL, the increased GPX activity, the reduced DNA damage, are based on surrogate outcomes.
Can you clarify that distinction with a relatable analogy for the listener?
Certainly. Think of it this way. A clinical outcome is winning the war. A patient having a longer, healthier life without a major cardiac event is the win.
Okay.
A surrogate outcome is winning a small local skirmish. Measuring reduced oxidized LDL is like confirming that your cellular defense unit is performing better against fat degradation. We hope that consistently winning those small skirmishes leads to winning the war, but the two are not guaranteed to correlate.
We rely on surrogates because hard clinical trials are incredibly complex, requiring decades of follow-up and enormous investment.
Precisely. Proving that a dietary intervention reduces cancer risk requires following tens of thousands of people for 10 to 20 years. Relying solely on surrogates, however, is a scientific risk because biological systems are complex. It is entirely plausible that better antioxidant status links to less disease, but until we have the necessary long-term human data to confirm this translation when the intervention is Brazil nuts, well, any claim about longevity or robust cancer or heart disease prevention in the general population remains purely speculative based on the available evidence.
So what does the scientific community identify as the critical research priorities moving forward to address this massive knowledge gap? If they wanted to prove the cardiovascular benefits, what would that trial look like?
The requirements are clear. We need large, adequately powered long-term randomized controlled trials. These trials need to last significantly longer than the typical 12-week nutritional study, ideally 5 to 10 years. The subjects must be carefully stratified, and the study must be double-blinded and placebo-controlled.
And the most important factor, the endpoints.
The primary endpoints must be hard clinical outcomes. Incidence of stroke, hospitalizations for heart failure, or confirmed mortality rates. Furthermore, given the toxicity risk we detailed in Section 2, the future of this research needs to focus on controlled dosing, perhaps utilizing standardized Brazil nut flour or extracts, rather than relying on the wildly unpredictable whole nut.
So you know exactly how much selenium everyone is getting.
Exactly, to ensure the participants are receiving a consistent, verified therapeutic dose that doesn't push them toward toxicity. Until those large-scale RCTs are done, we are making health claims based purely on observed beneficial biochemistry.
So let's bring this home. We've dissected the science, the risks, and the gaps. For the listener right now, how do we safely and effectively incorporate this incredibly potent, potentially risky food into our diet based only on the high-certainty evidence we've just discussed?
The evidence provides a very clear, highly practical rule that prioritizes safety over maximum theoretical benefit.
Lay out the evidence-based dose for us.
The optimal strategy for most adults, especially those with normal or slightly low selenium status, is to consume 1 to 2 Brazil nuts most days, or 2 nuts every second day.
And that's it.
That's the regimen supported by the robust data from the Thomas 2008 trial, showing it effectively corrects low selenium and maximizes those beneficial antioxidant biomarkers without risking a chronic overload. It respects the 400 microgram UL by averaging out the intake.
That requires treating it like a supplement, not a handful of snacks. And it's important to remember that this controlled regimen is most beneficial for specific target groups, those who have the most to gain. Who should be the first people incorporating this 2-nut rule?
We can clearly identify the key target groups based on who showed the greatest therapeutic response in the clinical trials. First, individuals with confirmed low baseline selenium. This includes people living in known low-selenium soil regions, strict vegans or vegetarians who may have difficulty sourcing selenium, or those who rely on highly processed diets.
Okay.
Second, patients with chronic kidney disease, especially those on hemodialysis. These patients consistently show severe selenium deficiency and marked, documented benefits from repletion, including improved lipid profiles and that NRF2 upregulation we talked about.
Right.
Third, overweight or obese adolescents and adults for the targeted improvement in oxidative stress markers and lipid surrogates, particularly when the intervention is used alongside a broader weight management or energy-restricted diet. And finally, older adults with mild cognitive impairment.
But with a big asterisk.
A huge asterisk. Only if a baseline selenium deficiency is also present, and pending the necessary replication of that small pilot data.
Now, for the essential safety advice, the cautions and interactions, we've established the enormous variability and the danger of the UL, but let's hammer home that critical upper limit recommendation.
The number one rule is restraint. Do not routinely consume more than 3 to 4 nuts daily. Given the enormous, unstandardized variability we discussed in Section 2, where a single high-potency nut can exceed the entire daily safe allowance, chronic consumption of a handful of nuts is highly likely to push you over that 400 microgram UL, leading to the risk of selenosis.
So if you don't know where your nuts are from,
You must restrain yourself to the 1 to 2 nut rule. It's the only safe way.
And finally, medication checks. Because selenium is so biologically powerful and acts as a metabolic regulator and an antioxidant, it can interact with serious therapeutic agents.
This is a non-negotiable step. If you are taking any of the following classes of medications, consultation with a clinician is absolutely necessary before incorporating high selenium foods like Brazil nuts regularly, especially if you plan to exceed the minimal dose.
Okay, what's on that list?
Key concerns include 1. Anticoagulants like warfarin. There is a theoretical concern that very high selenium intake or even the vitamin E content within the nuts could potentially potentiate the effects of blood-thinning medications, increasing the risk of bleeding. This would necessitate closer monitoring of your INR.
Got it. What's next?
Second, cytotoxic chemotherapy like cisplatin or doxorubicin. This is a serious concern. Many chemotherapy agents rely on generating reactive oxygen species to kill rapidly dividing cancer cells. High-dose antioxidants, including selenium, may theoretically interfere with the efficacy of these treatments by neutralizing those necessary reactive species. Patients should avoid high selenium intake during active chemotherapy unless specifically advised by their oncologist.
And number 3.
Thyroid medications like levothyroxine. As we detailed, selenium profoundly affects the metabolism and conversion of thyroid hormones, T4 to T3. Excessive, unmonitored intake could potentially affect the stability of a patient's carefully calibrated thyroid medication dose, demanding strict monitoring of TSH and free thyroid hormone levels to maintain balance.
This deep dive has solidified the Brazil nut as perhaps the ultimate nutritional dichotomy. On one hand, it is nature's most highly potent selenium supplement, highly bioavailable, remarkably effective at optimizing selenium status, and proven to enhance antioxidant defense. That is high-certainty evidence, anchored by gold standard RCTs.
But that same incredible potency demands profound restraint. The nut's unique biological accumulation means it is simultaneously a targeted nutritional tool and a significant source of toxicity risk due to wildly unstandardized selenium content and the accumulation of concerning heavy elements like radium and barium. It forces us to redefine the Brazil nut from an unbounded superfood into a highly precise, highly cautious nutritional intervention.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for our listener to consider, a concept that sits at the intersection of nutrition science and food technology. Given this extreme unstandardized variability in selenium content, that one nut might contain 20 micrograms and the next 1,200 micrograms, and the documented risks from heavy metal accumulation and toxicity at high doses, should the focus shift away from consuming whole, unstandardized Brazil nuts?
Perhaps the safer, more rational, and scientifically verifiable path to leveraging the proven benefits is towards standardized food processing methods. Several high-quality clinical trials successfully used measured granulated Brazil nut flour or controlled nut butter, where the precise selenium dosage was chemically verified and controlled before being given to participants.
So we can engineer the risk out of it.
We have the technology to bypass the inherent dangerous variability of nature and deliver the precise therapeutic dose. This highlights a critical tension. Do we prioritize the supposed unverified benefits of a whole food matrix with all its inherent risks? Or do we prioritize controlled dosage and verifiable safety to maximize the proven health benefits? That is something worth mulling over the next time you consider the contents of your nut mix.
A question of precision versus the unpredictable nature of the whole food. Thank you for diving deep with us. Use this information to inform your diet and consumption choices responsibly.
Until next time.